Well, hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm going to call the January 4th, 2021 Select Board meeting to order. Happy New Year to everyone. I'll ask the clerk to call all those who are present on the Select Board.
Ms. Escobedo,
Present?
Ms. Hotchkiss,
Present.
Mr. Johnson,
Present.
Ms. Ackerman,
Present.
and myself, Ms. Bates, present.
It looks like the entire Select Board is here. Good. I'll read the consent agenda. We pleasurably have gift acceptance from Eric Green and Carmen Reese for $25,000 to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and from Mr. and Mrs. John J. Langen, $800 to the Council on Aging, and with our gratitude to both of them for their generous donations.
Linda, is that the first private donation to the housing fund?
Yes, it is.
Wow, that's lovely.
Yeah.
Very nice. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. Again, our hearty thanks to everybody for that. Town managers report.
Oh, wait. Do you want to approve the consent?
Yes, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Move to approve.
I'm so excited about the generous donations from our citizens that
I get it. Yeah. Well, I move to approve the consent agenda.
Is there a second?
Second.
Ms. Escobedo,
Aye, with gratitude.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Ms. Ackerman,
Aye.
Ms. Hotchkiss,
Aye.
and myself, Ms. Bates. Aye.
And that's unanimous. Thank you very much. Now the town managers report.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I did send out a printed report over the weekend. I will share that my head must have been into New Year's Eve early because I thought I had sent it before I left on Thursday. And then when I opened my computer on Saturday, there it was sitting in my tray unsent. So I apologize for that. I heard you guys talking about vaccines when I chimed in. So there was a brief update on the vaccine clinic, and so I took that picture last week. I was there. I took another picture today. The structure is pretty much complete, and a news and notices just went out a few minutes ago to the community about the vaccination process and how that's being established. So, I think most of us who are watching this carefully know that it's the CDC passes the rules down through Massachusetts Department of Public Health, Mass DPH. And the DPH then sets the order of who gets vaccinated, the number of vaccines each community gets, and a lot of other, I say restrictions, but the protocols for the vaccination program. We don't determine that locally. We did send out a communication to townspeople through news and notices about how that works, what the priorities are, and how they get set. And just to let people know that we don't really have the ability at the local level to accelerate the timeline or change the order of priority. Those are state level decisions. I'm sure as the fire chief was discussing, we are gearing up for hopefully next week, the beginning of our regional first responders clinic. And hopefully once that gets started, our hope is to not stop vaccinating until we get through all of the priority orders as set by the state. Are there any questions about vaccines before I move on? Yes, Jane.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because Concord and actually other towns near us, perhaps throughout Massachusetts, have populations that are not necessarily residents of Concord. I'm thinking about our private schools, our, and obviously our assisted living facilities and other nursing or, Emerson Hospital, et cetera. How do those people get counted? Like in other words, what town would determine the number? If the state's determining the number of vaccines, does this logic follow? I'm just trying to understand it.
I think since most of those populations would be in the third phase, which would be ostensibly starting in April, we will get additional guidance as we get closer to those dates. But as we sit here right now, I haven't, and I'm Tom, if you have, but I haven't heard anything with any specificity related to. So the only non-Concord population that I know is specified is the prison population, and they are in phase 1, I believe. Tom, if you've heard anything different, Tom?
No, and I'm trying to find my camera switch here. I apologize. The only thing, Jane, I think you just asked about students, and education K through 12 is in phase 2. So I am assuming that for the schools like Middlesex and Concord Academy, again, I'm assuming Susan could probably speak better to this than I can, but I'm assuming that they will be counted in our population, because I would not think that they're going to return to their homes for their vaccine.
Thanks. I just was curious as to how that was all being determined.
If we find out more on how that's going to work, we'll certainly bring that information back. I just haven't heard specifically on boarding schools. So also, I didn't include in the packet the decision rendered by the planning board related to the 1440, 1450 Main Street project, or I think it's called Center in Maine. It's a lengthy document, but I think a very comprehensive one. I won't summarize too much of it here, but there are, I think, 55 conditions that the developer has to meet to gain site plan approval. And so that decision was a culmination of a tremendous amount of work by a lot of people, especially by DPLM and Chief Planner Elizabeth Hughes and her team. But it's a big project. It's been somewhat controversial, but I think the planning board has really worked through a lot of complicated issues to get to that decision. So I think, like I said, it's a pretty big regulatory step in the process. We've talked about this a little bit, but we think this week the CMLP third-party vendor will go live. So from now on, if there is a significant weather event, when people call for outages or for other services, they will not. They'll go to this third party. If our customer service representatives aren't at CMLP, instead of going to Concord Police Dispatch, which helps. I think helps both CMLP and CPD. And so they're training this week, and I'm sure the fact that we'll have them on board will guarantee no additional inclement weather events for the rest of the year.
Yeah.
Well, it'd be worth it if that happened.
Yeah.
Like when I bought the snowblower after the snowstorm last year and it didn't snow again for the whole year, something like that.
Yeah.
So I put in a quick note here just about budget and capital planning. We are starting the process of, and I say starting, we've been talking about getting the budget message out and working on that. So that the department heads should be receiving the budget message sometime this week. We've been just talking about what are the assumptions that are going to go into that, but just so folks have some level of awareness of what we're thinking, we are going to build off of the revised FY21 budget, not the original FY21 budget, because we don't foresee the revenue circumstances really. And there are obviously economic impacts, but I think we look at that for the budgeting purposes through the lens of the revenue impacts. And so we don't see much of a change at this point. In fact, we do see that it could be potentially worse because of possible reductions to state aid. So we'll be taking a pretty conservative approach to both capital and budget as we prepare the FY22 version. Another thing that's come up quite a bit, I know recently as well, is our email servers. And so we are in the process of doing an upgrade there to be more cloud-based. And so that's something that will be in the works fairly shortly. We are looking at what the migration process for that will look like. But I just want to, I think with each of you, I've talked at one time or another about Outlook issues. I want to let you know that we are moving that forward, and we think it'll be a tremendous service improvement for our town departments and those who are on boards and committees who do have concordma.gov email addresses. There may be some disruptions associated with that. I'm not sure, but we'll obviously provide more info. I'll have Jason Bulger come back when we get closer to doing all that to kind of give a heads up on what that's going to look like. And I report this under the COA. It is really more through our social services, but through some of our programs that help those in need over the holiday season, Concord's generosity was once again evident, and a lot of needy people got help that I know was greatly appreciated. So I want to thank Concord residents who supported those funds. It really made a big difference in those families' lives in the holiday. And then a couple other things. The biggest thing is to check the town's compost site websites or solid waste recycling website for information. But basically, holiday trees, lights, and styrofoam will be able to be collected at the compost site. So holiday lights and styrofoam will be the first 3 Saturdays, and then holiday trees are the first 3 Fridays and Saturdays, and then the lights and styrofoam will just be done on the Saturdays. There's no charge for trees and lights, but the styrofoam is $7 a bag. And then we will be working on a renovation of our Andersack Hill reservoir, that's a big project. That's going to be a nice enhancement for that important infrastructure. And then I did throw a picture in there of the progress of the library expansion project. Is going very well, on time, according to Library Director Kerry Cronin as of this morning. And it seems like they're making a tremendous amount of progress. So it's fun to see things like that come out of the ground. That's all I have for this evening.
Matt.
I just wanted to say, first of all, I really appreciate the written town manager reports. I found them really helpful. And this latest one, the best of all. And that I also was able to personally experience driving down the Cambridge Turnpike, and I didn't manage to collect a speeding ticket, but it's quite smooth and dead straight. So very nice to see that completed.
Yeah, Matt, I appreciate you bringing that up. Like I said, we've had kind of a soft opening on that. I think we're, pretty well done. Certainly the contractor has substantially demobilized, but I also in the middle of last week, took my maiden voyage down it, and, it really turned out great. And it turned out great because, it was expensive, but it was also a well-managed project, I think, by and large. CPW put in a lot of time and energy. We had a consultant engineer that also did. It was not an easy project. We did have some pretty tough moments that we were able to work out and get through and get the work done. Like I said, I think I had reported a couple months ago there were some, we think, defects in the original construction on some of the culverts and stuff. And sometimes that can lead to projects stopping, in effect, and we were able to work through all of that and get it done, and it really turned out beautiful. So credit to those involved.
Now we just need to install the toll booths.
Jane, you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to I second Matt's comments. It's great to get a written report. It gives me time to actually catch up in my brain before we listen. And the one thing I wanted to add was at the end, you mentioned Giroux's approach, which is, thank you for updating us on that. And also just wanted to mention in the Giroux, as well as the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail, I know that we're seeing a lot of commentary on that. That's not my liaisonship. I'll let others discuss that. But I also want to just remind everybody, White Pond is still moving. It's really in a public information gathering stage. And so just as when we mention one, I always want to sort of balance them together. And the other thing I wanted to mention, and I know it was on your mind because I saw you there, was the amazing outpouring of West Concord love, support, and honor for the last day. Sad, cry me. Can't believe it's gone, for the 5 and 10, for the 5 and dime. I hope Maynard does not leave us as a local, and I hope perhaps maybe he'll be more available. But wow,
Yeah,
that was a wonderful thing to witness, both the parade of cars and I think we might not have been anywhere close to appropriate guidance, but I will just trust that everybody who attended also was careful. It was great to see everybody.
I'll neither confirm nor deny the numbers of people that I observed there, but I will say that it was, as someone relatively new to the community, I've been fortunate to get to know Maynard a little bit. I was also fortunate that I went in for my last shopping excursion there the night before because you couldn't get near the place. So, on Thursday. And, you know, I've seen community support for, you know, in various communities for different people in different roles. And for someone who is a relatively small business person, that's probably one of the biggest, you know, I say send off, but one of the biggest tributes I think I've seen, and the just a genuine feeling for him and what the 5 and 10 means to that community was really palpable. Even like I said, as a relative new person, I could see that, wow, this is really something that people hold dear. So I'm glad I went.
Yeah.
There's a graphic suggestion for the next annual town meeting report.
Yes,
Brilliant.
yes.
Susan, comment?
Yeah, I wanted to thank Stephen also for the report and also for including the whole document on 1440 Main Street. I think I might have given it short shrift last week when I reported, because it really just focused on the lots that they wanted to hold aside, because that was the discussion. But there were many iterations of a few iterations of the planning board during the process, because it's been going on for years, which Matt probably knows more about than any of us. But I appreciate getting that information and having it be a public part of our documentation. So thank you.
Yeah, if I could just make one follow-up comment to that. Susan, I appreciate you saying that, and Matt can testify to this, like you said as well. A few big issues end up getting a lot of discussion airtime, but I think when you read that decision, there's a lot of very granular pieces of information that I don't say are equally as critical, but that are also critical to the review and approval. You know, cubic yards of fill either coming in or going out, number of trees, the drainage, the stormwater impacts, you know, wastewater management. I mean, all those things. It's pretty complicated, and so the folks that in this organization that really are kind of the gatekeepers to protect the community's interests on those fronts do a really remarkable job in a very detailed way. And so I appreciate the work that they do.
Good. Terry?
Right. Well, it's hard to add much. I second what everybody else has said. The outpouring from Maynard Forbes was really fantastic. And I think there were hundreds of people there, and the spirit, you could feel it. And I want to thank the West Concord Advisory Committee and the West Concord Junction District Cultural Council and everybody else who organized it. It was really well organized. The fire and police were helpful. It was terrific. And also this town manager report was really good. And I just do appreciate being kept up to date. We have a lot going on. And you're right, Stephen, sometimes a few issues get a lot of airtime. But just in this one report, we've got capital and budget, Giroux, IT, library, planning board. There's a lot going on in town. So it's great to be kept up to date. And I also appreciate being kept up to date with Susan Rask and the Department of Public Health reports that we get, and also about the oil spill. So all of that, thank you.
Well, I appreciate you pushing me on it, Terry. You were pushing on getting back to a written report, and it took me a while to figure out how to do that when we're all working remotely, but working with the department heads, we figured out a way to make it somewhat efficient and timely. So I agree. It's a much better vehicle.
Also, your verbal going over it at this meeting, I think is really good for the public to understand what we're all involved in.
Okay. Well, I think we've had ample feedback here and some very good feedback, so everyone can feel good about that. Let's move on to the Affordable Housing Funds update, and I see Liz Russ is here this morning and afternoon, I should say, and I assume she is going to speak to that. Stephen, did you want to say anything prior to that, or?
No, just, you know, when the request was made, there's, you know, we talk a lot about affordable housing projects, and so there's what's been kind of talked about and conceptual commitments, if you will, or and I think commitments is kind of air quotes there, and what's actually been obligated by agreement or appropriation. And so I kind of wanted, I think we had provided before the summary of the actual commitments, like the financial commitments, but that didn't capture some of the other things that are happening and some of the other potential commitments that I wanted Liz to kind of come here and maybe touch on some of those that may be around the corner.
Okay, good. So Liz, thank you for being here today.
Yes, hi. I'm glad to be here. I just dialed in out of interest. I didn't know I had a speaking part, so I'm not sure what is this about the financial commitments from the town meeting appropriations? Is that what you're asking about?
Well, yeah. Sorry, Liz. Yes, that and the things that may be coming down the pipeline that may be on your radar screen that aren't necessarily at the request for commitment level yet. That may be soon, if you're aware of any.
Sure. I just want to see. I think I sent to you what I had for the financial commitments from the town meeting article. I think that I'm just looking for that here, though. Did you have that available at all? No. Hold on.
Yeah. So I have it here.
Thank you. I thought you might. So there was the house at the CHDC, the Habitat project,
yep.
Right?
So the sum of it is from 2019. 200,000 has been appropriated, and it's 150,000 for the Main Street project. Is that 900 something Main Street?
930.
930 Main Street, and then 50,000 for the Concord Housing Authority Giroux study.
Right.
And none of the 2020 annual town meeting funds, that 500,000 have been appropriated yet.
I think that it was 500,000 for each of the town meeting, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So are there things that you're aware of that may be coming that may be looking for some portion of that from the town or when the Affordable Housing Trust gets established?
Right. So the CHDC put in a CPC request, which I think that you have discussed. I'm not sure if I know exactly what your recommendation was to the Community Preservation Committee. They put in a request for $500,000 to support buy down of an existing home to an affordable home, sort of a conversion from market rate to affordable. That's come up as a priority in virtually every planning document and plan, affordable housing from the master plan through the CPC plan. So to have funds available for market opportunities that come forward, also to have funds available for preservation of deed restrictions on, in particular, an Emerson Annex that has expiring deed restrictions. So should there are 4 units there, and should they come up for resale, the town, in order to preserve the affordability, funds would need to be available right then to continue the affordability there. So for those 2 purposes, they put in $500,000. I believe that in some discussions, that amount might be reduced or recommended to be reduced, is what I've kind of heard. I don't think that they've taken formal votes yet. Maybe that's this week, their upcoming meetings. So something like that, if there was funds not made available through that article, those would be coming to these town meeting appropriated funds. In terms of development projects, I'm not aware of any. I don't know of any.
Yes, Matt.
Well, I think that some of this also just came from discussions out of the Community Preservation Committee where there was some confusion about the sort of way that now the affordable housing appropriations will work when there's this trust fund as well as the community, the Concord Housing Development Corporation. And so there's kind of two buckets of money, and how does it flow through? Who's in charge? That's I think some of the confusion that people had about kind of where this money is, who's controlling it, how does it flow from one group to the other if it does, and also will there be future town meeting appropriations, to that
Right.
fund exclusively. And so now will the CHDC always just get their money from the trust fund, or how does that work?
Well, the trust fund isn't available yet in order to, because the trustees really need to be recruited and appointed, and the trust document recorded. So there's some paperwork that needs to be done before the trust is available as a funding resource. So
But
that
that's
was
coming
also
soon, presumably, right?
presumably. So I think that the CHDC application also made mention of it, that it was just for this year, and in the future, the trust would play a different role. So this was just for now until the trust is operational.
But then, like in future CPC years, what will happen? Because we, of course, need to allocate a certain percentage to affordable housing each year.
Mm-hmm.
Does that go in the future to the trust fund, or does it go to the CHDC, or to a specific project? Or I guess, again, I'm not clear on how, if this trust fund is put into place, how that affects the process.
Well, every year, so the trust would have to request the CPC funds every year. So there's no.
So the trust would be requesting, making.
Right. There's no such thing as sort of standing instructions, right? Like you need to
right.
reserve them for affordable housing. But so someone is making a specific request, and the trust could make a request every year for the 10% or for something like that. Yeah.
But a private party could also request money from CPA directly.
Yeah, and then so the CHDC's role in the future is more of a sort of a negotiating arm, for making, purchases or buy downs or other kinds of deals. I guess I'm again
So the
curious about the ongoing role of the CHDC versus the trustees.
The CHDC is the development organization in Concord. The trust isn't envisioned, as it's been discussed, to be a development arm because of its, it's more of a funding kind of, entity. It's subject to public construction, public procurement, where the CHDC is not.
So there will be
That's a major
more of a
difference.
distinct separation between the funding entity and the development entity going forward.
Mm-hmm.
Today, it's sort of the CHDC is handling kind of both in some cases.
Well, I think that they're really the development organization.
But they ask for funds, I guess.
Well, they ask for funds for specific purposes.
Okay.
So maybe this would be helpful, if I may. When you have affordable housing projects, no matter who the developer is, in this case, if we want to use CHDC as an example, a parcel of land comes up that they are able to, it gets donated, for example, and they want to develop a project. That project, the construction of that project, is going to require a subsidy of some amount to retain the affordability. Because if you're trying to keep a unit affordable and you're building it either new or through renovation, that cost isn't going to be offset by whatever rent or sale price you're going to have. And so that gap between what it costs to develop versus what you want to keep it at the rate of affordability is going to have to be bought down, if you will. And so the Affordable Housing Trust, the way I understand it, is the Affordable Housing Trust is going to be a funding mechanism in part to finance that gap. And I think if you look at the Christopher Heights project, there are multiple funding sources to write down that difference between.
Sure, but as far as
cost
the
to
town
complete-
funding source, that primary funding source now in the future would be the trust.
Well, primary depends on the project, but I think the town's, for lack of a better term, skin in the game, if you will, on a particular project would be done through the Affordable Housing Trust. But CHDC may be a developer, they may be a facilitator. It just depends on where the project is, who's developing it, how it comes together. But for the town to be a partner to make sure that we retain that affordability and have some say in how the project gets developed, the Affordable Housing Trust really gives us that role. Is that, I don't know if I helped or hurt on that one.
So if I may also comment that some good questions are being asked. I don't think we totally have all the answers on this yet, and we won't until some details are worked out with the Affordable Housing Trust itself. Not all communities with Affordable Housing Trust, and Liz, you can correct me on this if I'm in error, necessarily apply annually to CPC for the 10%, because sometimes the CPC is taking projects on for community housing that are a larger segment of their percentage of the amount of money. So this is something that I think the trust will continue to work on and come back probably to the select board and to others to think about that. In addition, I think the trust is, and again, remind me if I'm remembering incorrectly, Liz, that they also built into the bylaws that they would want to carefully spell out the housing goals and make sure policy goals and come back to the select board and make sure that they were in agreement on those. So there's a lot of work to be done there. So I think some good questions are being asked, but I don't think we generally have an idea of where this is going to go. But I think there is some work.
So I have a good chart that I can show you that the trust put together back when, that can just answer this very briefly, if that's helpful.
And Liz, before you do that, I'll just also mention that in our packets today, in the 54 findings for Main Street project, the 3 lots are set aside for affordable housing, and the town has 3 years to consider whether they are going to purchase them at market rate. So there's another project that should that come to fruition, there will probably be multiple sources of funding that are necessary to take care of that.
Did I do that? Did I share that?
Great, thank you.
I'll just do this very quickly. So this was part of a presentation that the Trust Study Committee put together. And you can see here at the top, like the affordable funding sources. So this is where all the money would come from. There are funding entities here, and all of these entities hold money and provide money to development entities who are down here at the bottom. So maybe that helps to segment out the different groups. They all have kind of different purposes and different charters, but they fall in this kind of category. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah.
Terry, you had a question?
Yes, Liz, that is helpful. And if there's a way to send that to us, I know we've seen it, but I'd like to keep a copy of that. That's very helpful.
Yeah,
sure.
So these are all really good questions, and it reminds us that we have to get going on appointing the trust committee. Is it time for us to start recruiting or announcing that we're looking for people for that committee?
Yep, Terry, you've brought that up several times before, and I think we agreed that was in this quarter as a priority.
All right, great. And my other question is, just to recap then, make sure I understood it. So we have 2 articles so far, 2 different town meetings, 2019 and 2020, each one $500,000 for affordable housing. And in the 2019, looks like then we've spent about $200,000 of the $500,000 on the habitat and the Giroux study. And on the 2020, we haven't spent any of it yet. Do I have those numbers correct? Okay, so then my question is, seeing as how we haven't yet, we're about halfway through the fiscal year. I'm wondering if you've been thinking, Liz and Stephen, if we're going to want to put in another article again for 2021 town meeting, or whether you think we might have enough to tide us over until next year or until we get the trust committee going.
I will say that from a budgetary standpoint, Terry, that's a good question. That is something we are looking at. I think it's that type of appropriation. It serves the town well to be built up a little bit over time, because usually if a project comes along of significance that we want to invest in, like a supporting habitat is great, but a one-off isn't really going to accomplish the town's goals. And so if something came along like a multi-unit development that we thought was a good investment, it would take more than 500,000 probably to get, to have, like I said, not only the subsidy, but also the level of, control or influence or input into how that project gets developed and constructed. But would we take a year off in light of the budget reductions that we've done in other areas? That may be something we need to talk about, because that is free cash. And I think we need to look at our free cash numbers, but that may be something that as we get closer to we may have it as something we put in, because we know that's an important goal and we need to keep, moving that forward. But as we get closer to town meeting, it may be something we need to look at. So the short answer, I don't know.
Susan.
I had a question about, I believe in 2019, when we voted, there were several articles for affordable housing, the 500,000, and then the two we're trying to get through the legislature for those surcharges on property transfer and surcharge on building permits. And my question is, I'm assuming that I'm going to be an optimist and say these will eventually happen. Those funds will go under the control of the Affordable Housing Trust. I mean, in that chart that Liz had, it was one of the sources of funding. But assuming we get one or both of those enacted, where would that money go? And maybe we don't know yet, but
I think that in the legislation, the draft legislation, it was written that it would go into the Affordable Housing Trust.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and just I think we talked about this maybe at a prior meeting, but the building permit legislation, we have gotten some communications from our delegation staff about that. So that is, I say, moving forward. It's getting some attention at the end of the legislative session. The transfer fee, that one's has I think a little more opposition. So I don't see anything in this legislative session on that. But we're kind of in a wait and see to see if it's one of the things that gets passed, that gets pushed through before they adjourn sine die, and then if not, we'll have to reintroduce it to the next session.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions for Liz while she was here? Thank you very much, Liz, for responding on the spot for our questions here. Thank you. Okay, the next item on the agenda is the legal services budget discussion, and Town Council Mina Macarius is here to walk us through that. Welcome, Mina.
Thank you. Good afternoon and Happy New Year, everyone. Let me first start by saying I'm really happy to hear good news on the Cambridge Turnpike. Among the, no pun intended, bumps in the road that we've encountered were changing engineers and some construction related impacts. And to second what Stephen said, I think the project has really benefited from proactive staff on the town side to keep it moving and to anticipate issues. And when the first engineer wasn't anticipating issues, finding another one. So congrats on that. I look forward to using it when I can see you all in person. Purpose for today's update was just to give you a sense. We're about halfway through the year, the fiscal year, on where our work stands on a variety of things and where it stands relative to the budget. I know you've been getting updates on the one piece of pending litigation that Anderson and Krieger is handling Estabrook on a fairly regular basis in executive session as needed. I'll provide a little bit of update on that on the budget side, but I also want to make sure that some of the other stuff that as also caught a little bit of the town manager's report and kind of similar note that some of the stuff that happens day to day may not, we may not have a chance to talk about together as much. So I'll try to be brief, but comprehensive. So I'll actually start with the general budget, the general town council work that's happening between July 1st and the end of November, which was the last invoice that we've sent over. The billable fees were roughly $54,000. 2,000 of that actually was related to construction work, which we keep in a separate bucket. But the rest was general town council work. December was a somewhat heavy month, so I would add to that maybe another little, actually over 20,000. Let me explain why those numbers came about. From my understanding, again, as of late November, that was actually a little bit below the pace of spending in prior years for the general budget. So while the overall legal budget has been large, and we're hoping that it doesn't last too much longer, as I'll get to when we talk about Estabrook, that the general budget has actually been in line with prior years and actually a little bit below it. The numbers are especially notable given that we also had town meeting, so that includes a later town meeting than usual. So our work during that time, just a few of the things, affordable housing has been appropriately something you've talked about quite a bit here. And the first thing is we worked on the Junction Village TIF agreement leading up to town meeting, and have started to in the last month or so working with Liz and one of my real estate colleagues, Jillian Barger, on the various documents that CHDC is entering into. CHDC is a separate entity, but since the town has a lot of money invested in the project, we've been asked to review the ground lease as well, not negotiate everything, but review and participate in those meetings. And we're doing that, again, through one of our senior associates who does a lot of our real estate work. Unlike other years, there hasn't been a lot of other real estate work, so that those numbers have been fairly limited. In terms of the only other litigation that was ongoing during this fiscal year was the library litigation. That settlement was finalized early in the fiscal year. The settlement was largely between the private party abutters and the library itself. Our involvement was somewhat minimal and in advising the HDC and the ZBA on implementation issues of the settlement, because I had to go back before the full board. So that ended actually before town meeting. Most of the general work, and actually the reason for some of the expense in December, has been involving two planning board projects, both subdivision control projects, and I believe I've heard reference to one a little bit earlier, the Center in Maine project. That project has now been approved by the planning board. It still needs other approvals before it can move forward. Most importantly, the earth fill and removal permit from the ZBA. When we were asked to, actually, before I say this, another sort of facet of very proactive town government that I have been happy to see in Concord over the years, your planning and land use staff, I think, are exceptional. I just from experience across a bunch of different towns, and they have guided boards on a variety of issues with pretty limited involvement from us, except as needed, but they're very good at spotting issues when they come up. And in this particular case, the applicant had a host of issues and the board had raised a host of issues involving one, what the planning board's role was in the earth removal versus the ZBA's. The site is somewhat unique in its topography. And that raised a bunch of issues. And the Developers Council came in pretty early on objecting to the existence of the inclusionary housing bylaw and what it means for the planning board and what it has to do. That bylaw has been on the books since 1992. It was approved by the AG. It was never challenged. I believe it's come up several times. Mr. Johnson may actually remember more of those times than me because it has never actually been something that's litigated or even appealed. And so the part of the involvement was getting an interpretation early on of the bylaw and whether it remained valid. Our view is that it does remain valid. While not many towns, to be honest, have something like this, we believe it is a legally permissible thing to do, especially because it's limited by the very important caveat that if you were to buy those parcels that were set aside, it has to be for just compensation, which is something you could do through a taking anyway, and you would still need town meeting approval. So working with the planning board, myself and a colleague spent quite a bit of time actually with the planning board chair on these issues and attending planning board meetings. And I think we have a decision now that was finalized end of December, which has narrowed a lot of the issues that were in dispute and leaves only the issue that frankly we can't resolve the dispute ahead of time, which is we still believe that bylaw says what it says and the planning board is required to follow it. The appeal period hasn't run. I do hope that with the approval and what I think are reasonable conditions, that's the end of this process. If it's not, we may see some litigation expense in the spring on that, unfortunately, but that's only if the developer appeals the permit, the approval. And even then, we'd of course work to find ways to make that litigation as efficient as possible, including, among other things, seeing if we can wait till the ZBA process is done before going into court to talk about one approval that's necessary but not sufficient for the project. So as I said, that's sort of been the bulk of our time over the last couple of months in terms of billable fees in a general matter. The last thing is we've also spent quite a bit of time on public records requests that have come to the town, including a somewhat expansive one filed by an attorney without naming a client, which he has a right to do. And we spoke with the attorney and have been able to phase that so that it is less daunting for both town staff and hopefully less expensive overall. It covers documents, basically every document in litigation. In the Estabrook case, personnel related matters and a few other things. So it's very broad, and we're trying to provide the information that's required by law, but also make sure it's done efficiently for both sides. So we're not spending as much time as could be spent on something that big. So that's sort of the general overview. In terms of upcoming events, we've already reviewed the CPA projects for this year. Everything came out, I think, as eligible, not a whole lot of curveballs. That's done. I'm sure we'll be in the next couple of months beginning to turn our attention to the town meeting warrant and review of that. We usually work closely with planning staff separately on the more meaty changes to the zoning bylaw. I don't know, actually, and you would know better than me, if there have been citizens petitions submitted yet, et cetera, which we usually review for substance, not form, when they come in. And of course, whatever else you would like to add to that. So hopefully we have as much as I don't wish more spending in any one fiscal year. I'd love it if all of us could have a town meeting within this fiscal year rather than the next one. So it would be a good sign that we've moved forward enough to do that. And so those are sort of the general items. Before I turn to Estabrook, any questions, any comments? Stephen and Linda, I'll defer to you on whether you want to open it up for that.
Yeah, Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, so when it comes to something like the memo that you reviewed, the CPC items, is that funded out of the CPC administration budget, or is it funded out of the town, general fund?
Carrie may be better able to speak to that. As a matter of our billing, we make sure it goes in a CPC bucket so that if it's eligible for funding in the administrative bucket, it can. The same is true when there's a CPC funded capital project. We usually separate it out so that if it's a related administrative cost, it can come from CPC.
And the same thing with like the planning board related items, comes out of the planning department budget, planning division budget.
Carrie, I'll let you speak to that too. I don't think so on that one, but go ahead.
I'm happy to respond, Stephen, if you want me to take this one. So, Matt, with respect to the first question about the CPC, it is a separate fund. You know, it's not part of the general fund. So I think historically, the initial, an initial review of projects we would charge to the general funds appropriation. But if anything got into any significant detail, we may look to charge the fund, like the CPC fund. All of the other funds we do charge legal to, all of the enterprise funds we charge legal to, but anything that's within the general fund comes under the general fund's appropriation, though we do code it. So for instance, I can't tell you what we've spent of the general fund's appropriation on planning issues, but it would not be charged to the planning department budget.
And then for the public information request, I assume that those are self-funding. I don't know, is there a funding offset? Or I guess when you present the numbers, it'd be just good to understand, okay, are these numbers that are from our general fund? Are these the total numbers across all departments? Then secondly, are these offset by some other revenue in effect? I don't know what you call it when the fees are paid to cover the public access requests. So I guess just clarity in terms of how these all get apportioned.
Sure. And so I can start, and Carrie, please fill in. I think generally speaking, Carrie just mentioned for the vast majority of the work we do, it is all general fund, and doesn't go to particular departments, with the exception if it's coming from a separate fund like the CPC. I think that's the one exception. And so that's that piece. On public records, I think it's a good question, and it's important to highlight why we work hard to try to minimize the cost, because it's not self-funding, and it actually, frankly, not even close. It is the supervisor of public records has taken the view that really the highest you can charge without going to them for a request for approval of a higher amount, which is rarely granted, is $25 an hour. And that is based, and you're also supposed to find the lowest paid employee or billing person who can reasonably do the work. $25 an hour is usually below what you pay most administrative people in the town, which is good. It's a good thing. So even just regular staff time, it's not self-funding. When it comes to matters involving redactions, privilege, searching for sensitive information, personal information, et cetera, often we or Labor Council have to get involved to review it. We also try to delegate it to the most reasonably priced lawyer that we can, or paralegal in some cases. So for sorting and you sort of searching and redacting, especially, we can sometimes have non-lawyers do at least the first pass. But even then, the rates often naturally exceed $25 an hour. So, and that's all to say too, that I think the town is always free to waive that fee, which in its discretion it has sometimes if something's easier to produce quickly. So that is part of it, and Carrie can speak to where those revenues sort of end up, but it's not really offsetting fully.
Yeah, it's not offset in the least. Not even close. I would agree with Mina.
Lydia, you're on mute.
Terry?
Yes, thank you for explaining that, Mina. I think it's very important for the public to understand that. And I think it would be really helpful for everyone if you have a lengthy public records request, if you have an estimate when we're finished, of how much it costs or how much it costs per year, some kind of general estimate, because I think it's a lot higher than people think. And my other question is maybe for Carrie. I'm not sure who would address this question, but Mina, that was a great overview that you gave us on the general services. And I know you're going to talk about litigation also. And I think there might be a third type of legal costs that we have. I'm a little bit confused. We have special counsel working on some other issues or litigations. And do those also come out of the same line item?
I can speak to that briefly, Terry. Sometimes we have issues that arise that are covered by our insurance. And so we'll have attorneys who work for Maya, our insurer, on those particular issues, and those do not come out of the legal services budget. An example of that is the hard drive issue. The attorney we're working with there is paid for by our insurance policy.
Okay, I'm thinking about, like NAGOG. We have a special counsel for that. So is that being charged to the Water Enterprise Fund or to the legal services budget?
Carrie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's the Enterprise Fund.
It is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which means it's funded by ratepayers.
Right.
Yeah. So Mina, if I may ask you a question, and that is, given your experience with other towns, what are some of the challenges that other towns are having with budgeting for legal expenses?
They're not all that different. Most of the other towns we work for, the hardest things for the town to dictate are the things that it can't fully control, which are litigation, because you have to deal with another party. And it's litigation is expensive in all fields, I think. Public records requests, and when it's useful to involve counsel or not is often an issue. A lot of things can be done internally, and in some ways that saves money. The problem is if it sort of a search ends up being cursory at the first instance, it can cost more money to correct that, and you sort of end up in a back and forth. I think, thankfully, again, Kate and others in town have done a very good job sort of spotting when that's going to be an issue, and bringing it to Stephen's attention and then to ours. So I think that's one place. There have been some additional costs that towns have incurred this year. I think you have had less of this, partly because you have fewer options with an open town meeting, but what to do with with COVID. So we, just figuring out how to adjust to a new reality. So we've spent more time advising boards of health, certainly than we have in past years in a lot of our towns. And I think then the last bucket is really sort of development related, and actually affordable housing. And I wouldn't say it's necessarily a struggle of figuring out what to do with it, but again, what's the most useful way to involve council? So in some instances, it has meant very close contact with folks in town to be sort of the negotiator and everything. Again, you have a little bit of an advantage, both from a funding standpoint and a personnel standpoint of having the RHSO. Several of our towns are in the RHSO because you have Liz and her staff and their experience, and some shared experiences, so you don't have to do everything for the first time on your own. But it does take some time. These are complicated real estate deals when affordable housing is involved.
All right, thank you. Okay, well, this has been helpful, and I think we thank you for being here today.
And Linda, did you want me to switch to Estabrook briefly, or before?
That would be good, sure.
Yeah, sorry to take more of your time, but yeah, so just a very brief summary of Estabrook from a budget standpoint. Obviously, my partner, Melissa Allison, has been the lead attorney on that and can say much more about the substance, but I've obviously been involved and had to be particularly involved this year in a number of issues. And so I just want to go through the budget. Towards the end of 2019, we had estimated about $150,000 in litigation costs, and we were completing expert discovery. We had the hope and I think the expectation that we would be through trial by the middle of last year. And obviously, partly because of the pandemic, actually directly because of the pandemic, the Land Court postponed all deadlines in March, and it became clear trial will be delayed. We did spend from April to July about $80,000 in legal fees that were not anticipated, that were related to the closure of the trail and resolving that issue by going to court and resolving the issue eventually. But first, before that, multiple rounds of trying to resolve it without going to court. There were also only about, in that period, was about $10,000 of fees for discovery that was anticipated going into the year. The rest was related to the trail closure. Since that time, after the court granted the motion for preliminary injunction, the court set a trial date for late February of this year and set pretrial deadlines. August through November, we worked on the pretrial memorandum. We responded to arguments regarding the Harvard settlement that these arguments ultimately led Harvard to rejoin the case. We filed motions in limine, meaning basically evidentiary motions. And in total, there was about $90,000 worth of work for that. And they were largely as a result of positions that we were responding to on evidentiary issues. And the court, I believe, by and large, agreed with the town on almost every one of those motions, if not all of them. So that was a little bit higher than expected. And I think the court's decisions bore out that we were in the right on that. There was also another about $10,000 to address and help the town respond to concerns about use of the trail following the injunction. We have, as you have, committed to doing what is required under the injunction, and that has required more attention in the past couple of months. And that's another source of that. All of that being said, I think we are hopeful that we are now, once again, close to the end here, and hoping we are this time, due to personal circumstances involving some of the defendants. A group of defendants asked for an extension of time on trial. The town agreed to that. But just as we talked about going into town meeting, the desire is to not have any party spend a lot of time and a lot of money when nothing is happening in court. And so Melissa, in speaking in front of the court, in the last hearing in front of the court, explained the town's concerns on that front. And we have basically the advice from the court is that if there is going to be anything that needs to happen before trial in June, that the parties are encouraged to have a status conference with the judge before anything else comes up, so that we're not litigating issues twice and spending money twice, either us or the defendants. We can all, I think, take a pause here if that's what is intended. So that's where we are, and we believe to get through trial at this point and to deal with some limited Harvard discovery with Harvard's re-entry into the case. We're probably looking at another $80,000. Hopefully, more of that will be spent closer to the end of the year as we prepare for trial. Some of the work preparing for trial obviously has been done in the past, but some of that remains, and for the trial itself.
Thank you for that summary. Okay. I think we got the update that we needed, and we appreciate your response to our questions. So thank you, Mina.
Thank you. And if there's nothing further, I will leave you for the evening. So good night.
Understandably. Thank you. Okay, the next item on the agenda is the 2020 CARES Act COVID-19 expenses. I had asked Stephen if we could look at this, and he said that we could earlier in January, giving the town the opportunity to summarize the procurement and expenses for 2019. So Stephen, I don't know if you want to say anything about that?
Yes, Linda, just a brief overview before I turn it over to Tom Judge and Carrie LaFleur, who do the real work of much of this. I think at the beginning when the CARES Act was announced, we received a tranche of money over $1.6 million. When we received the money, there were a few things we knew we needed to be doing right away, but then there were other things that we needed to see, that were evolving extraordinarily quickly. And then as we got to the end of the year, when most communities were on a deadline of December 31st to have whatever you spent the money on be in use by December 31st, there was a lot of pressure to identify expenditures that were needed and make sure that we had the orders in and the vendors were giving us the supplies and we were using them. And then, of course, on December, 29th or something like that, the federal government extended the CARES deadline into 2021. And so that prompted over the last few days a little bit of thinking of, well, would we have done things differently had we known that? Because we did fully obligate our funding. And Tom and Carrie can go into the details, but the short answer is that by and large, no. I think everything that we procured with CARES Act funding were things that we needed to continue working in the traditional model, be it disinfection and sanitizing equipment, air purifying equipment, or additional cleanings or cleaning supplies, hand sanitizer, wipes for offices, things like that, or in the new normal, including upgrades to our phone system, laptops, things like that we needed to give to employees so they could, our office space could comply with the governor's requirements, and we could continue to serve the residents of Concord. So I think there are labor costs that are going to be associated with pandemic response that are going to continue into 2021. And so I will say that as this evolves, we may look back at some of our expenditures and maybe recategorize some of them if needed. But that's a conversation that started less than a week ago because of the change that the federal government made at the deadline. It may not change anything, but at least we want to make sure we take a look to see were there other appropriations that we had that because of a lack of need during the regular fiscal year operations, we can then track those expenses in our operating budget as opposed to CARE. So that's kind of a longer introduction, but I think we've talked for months now about how fluid and ever-changing the situation is. And even with all of the months of work that went into planning and purchasing and the other thing is researching, evaluating operations, evaluating spaces. I mean, Ryan Orr, our facilities director, became an expert in air purification in ways that I'm sure he probably didn't think he was ever going to be. So there was a lot of work that went into each of these purchases. And so the one thing I guess I wanted to convey in all of that is we were very thoughtful in how we approached the CARES money and wanted to be as judicious and efficient as possible. And I think I feel like we by and large accomplished that. So I guess with that brief introduction, I would turn it over to Carrie and Tom to kind of go through, CARES Act 101 for, I know the boards have been briefed on this, but maybe members of the community who haven't been.
So who would like to begin?
I did it again. I was muted. Carrie, would you like me to start?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe
You didn't fight me for that. So the CARES Act I know that this was in your packet, but the CARES Act went into effect on March 27th when the president signed it into law. It is one of the two funding sources that we're using to recover money. The other is the FEMA Public Assistance Grant, which is very common during any declared disaster, which this was also declared on March 27th. The CARES Act at the very beginning had guidelines which are part of the summary that we sent, and there were three guidelines. They were essentially the expenditure had to be necessary, incurred due to the public health emergency with respect to the coronavirus. They had to be they could not have been accounted for in the budget most recently approved, and they could not have been planned for. And the expenses had to be incurred between March 1st, 2020 and December 30, 2020. So that was the only guidance at the very beginning. And it was probably at least a month or more into it before they started developing some more detailed guidance. And it built off of those three main points. And the guidance just drilled down into more specificity. As we started making, well, let me back up. Very early on, I know in the fire department and other departments, we were scrambling to find equipment, and we were scrambling to find PPE. So all of those things that we purchased, we were tracking right from the beginning, knowing that hoping that there would be some kind of assistance down the road. All of those types of purchases that we were PPE, dividers for public spaces, anything for social distancing, all of those things fit well into the categories provided by the CARES administrators. As we got further into it, then we started looking at purchases we need to make that were within the scope of, or within the guidelines, but we weren't 100% sure. And John Harris in finance took over the role of being the liaison with the state's CARES administrator, and we would pass purchase requests through John. John would deal in turn with the state and get a thumbs up or a thumbs down on a proposed purchase. The main categories that we made purchases in were equipment. I believe you've seen the list of the categories. We purchased some equipment for our ambulances. Townwide, there was a lot of PPE purchased. Technology, we purchased a number. Again, townwide, we purchased a number of laptop computers so that people could work at home. There was a lot of technology employed so that we could do what we're doing now, some meetings and the like. And I know it's used in many different ways. It just, speaking for the fire department, it's used on a daily basis at this point for training, because we've been essentially, cut off one station from the other. So it's in a lot of ways, it's how they communicate. Again, townwide, a lot of resources used for decontamination, both services, equipment, and supplies. Most recently, COVID testing. And as we prepare for vaccine down the road, where some of what we have acquired for testing is going to be able to be used for vaccination. So it's a benefit of that. Testing was approved for a CARES expense. Vaccine at the time was not, because it wasn't on the horizon yet, and it now is. So more decon, a lot of cleaning services. Then you see the electrostatic sprayers. That's another category within decon. You couldn't find these things. It's an electrostatic sprayer, which when you use it, it dispenses a disinfectant, and the electrostatic part of it has the effect of making it cling to the surface rather than just run off. And when we found them, we bought them, and they've been deployed through every department in town, and they are used frequently. additional trash services, and then some money that was dedicated to the schools. So those were the broad categories that we used. And like I said, at the beginning, there was very little guidance and the goalposts kept moving. And then towards the middle and then the end, the guidance was a little bit more drilled down. And with John's help dealing directly with the state, we were able to procure some things that we really needed. There were also some personnel costs in there, which the CARES will pick up the cost share portion that is not paid for by FEMA. So some of these things have they cross both lines, FEMA and CARES. Some are exclusively CARES and some are exclusively FEMA. So I hope I have explained that or described that well enough.
Thank you. Any questions for, yes, Susan?
Yes, thank you for that summary. It was very helpful to find out where the CARES money went. I did have one question on, there's an item called field hospital, and I just wondered if you could explain that a little.
Yeah, I meant to address that because that actually was, somebody asked me about that today, thinking that we were building an overflow hospital for COVID patients. Field hospital is just the FEMA or the CARES term that is used for the structure at the high school.
Oh, okay.
So that's just the term to fit within their model.
Okay, thanks.
Matt?
I saw in the town manager's report this note that we were able to purchase licenses of Office 365 with CARES Act funding, and it gave a number of 130,000. But when I look at the CARES Act allocation report, I don't see anything that ticks and ties with that. Is there some inconsistency there?
I'm going to defer to Kerry on that one because I don't have the specifics on that.
Sure. So some of our technology purchases, just because of the nature of them, and they are things that we would likely need for our business anyway, we're trying to decide whether or not we're going to charge that off to CARES or we would charge that to our own technology fund, our own annual capital for technology. And now that we know that the original deadline has been pushed out and we're still in pandemic response and likely still going to be incurring expenses, we've just sort of pulled out some of those technology costs that we know that they are eligible for CARES Act spending because they've been approved by the state, but that we may be able to fund within our own existing appropriations.
Okay, yeah, because they do seem like more routine types of expenses. I mean, we need to have some office automation, and that was something we had before and that we're going to have in the future. It's just how we're providing it is changing, it seems like to me. Yeah.
Well, I think the big thing there, if I may, is eligibility. It's, there were things that we needed to do, and I think I spoke about the phone systems. The phone systems needed to be upgraded at some point in time in the near future. What we learned when we had to work remotely is that we really couldn't effectively do that without an upgrade to the phone system, which is in the works, and that was approved because enabling telework was one of the big categories that for eligibility for CARES. And so I think the big thing is, making sure if we needed to have it funded by CARES, we could. Like I said, as the pandemic has endured and additional expenses have come up, as I said at the beginning, we're now looking at, and then the deadline is now extended. We're like, okay, well, do we need to take a second look at this? But then the other thing is we're moving forward with needed upgrades. And if there's a second round of federal funding that is essentially the same model as CARES to continue pandemic response through minimally the first half of 2021, we know that we don't have to go back and ask for eligibility if it's on the same like platform that CARES is. So that the eligibility component, knowing that is important.
Thanks.
Terry?
So is the phone system already included then in the graphs and reports that Carrie has here? If it is, like, which where is it in the pie chart?
I don't think that's in there either.
Right, so
Okay.
the phone system and the Office 365 have been pulled from the pie chart.
Okay, so about the other fund, the FEMA public assistance grant, so that didn't have a deadline, that's still ongoing. Might we use that funding for the phone system and the Office 365 if the CARES isn't renewed?
So the PA grant, I'll take this one if you don't mind, Stephen. The PA grant is it's rolling, and it'll be open as long as the disaster is still, under declaration. It's very limited in scope, and it will not pay for things like that. And there's actually started to be some pushback on submitting payments or requests that weren't specifically for police, fire, or EMS. So the scope of it's pretty limited, and that's the one where we get the 75%. We have the 25% cost share, and they pay 75%. But to answer your question, I know that they wouldn't pay for something like that.
And how much have we received approximately from this PA grant?
The PA grant, the FEMA PA grant, we haven't received anything yet, but we have one project outstanding that's in review, and we have another project that's going to be submitted in about 2 or 3 weeks. The one that's in review is for $210,000, and the one that's going in a couple of weeks is probably, I think it's going to probably be about $290,000.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to ask some basic questions here, and some of this is for the benefit of the public as well. And that is the amount, the grand total is close to 1.7 million. And you've noted some unassigned categories for town and school. So if you could speak to both of those areas, that would be helpful. And then the other question related, we've mentioned that some of this has been set aside for schools. Is there some kind of general division between what is specific for municipal versus the schools?
Terry, do you want to take that one?
I was going to ask if Stephen wanted to talk about with the schools, how you...
Yeah, so right, and actually it was, I just want to note that I observed that Susan, I think, had dropped out, and so I had sent her a message asking if she had dropped out. So I was looking at that. So yeah, the short of it is the schools got their own CARES funding based on a per student formula, but I think in most communities it really wasn't sufficient to meet some of, they have increased demands for cleaning supplies and air purification and disinfection, things like that. And so we have set aside some funds, really kind of the remainder, if you will, to assist the school in their additional costs. Their costs are somewhat evolving as well. And so we wanted to set aside, like I said, some money to be able to assist them in meeting their pandemic response needs.
Okay. Jane.
First, Linda, you had a couple of basics, so I don't want to interrupt your list before I.
Well, the grand total, which is close to 1.7, was that the total amount that was allocated to Concord?
Yes.
To the town of Concord, and then an additional amount to Concord.
Okay, thank you. I just want to be clear about that. Okay.
And I should note that Minuteman also got an appropriation, but we also allocated them some additional funding as well. We received a request for additional funds from the town to help offset their increased costs split amongst the district towns.
Okay, thank you. Jane, go ahead.
So as I understand it, the CARES Act is 1.7 and FEMA is a application, you apply for, when it's more of a rolling option. So I assume the two projects, 210 and 290, are going to wait until we know whether or not we get approval from FEMA? Or is that kind of a, we're pretty sure that's already done?
Those are reimbursement requests at this point.
And there are budget lines that would cover those if they're disallowed?
Yes, at this point.
Oh, I'm just trying to, imagine what's worst case, what's best case.
Right. Worst case is that they disallow it, and those budgets are going to have to find a way to fund it. I think it's unlikely. I'm knocking on wood as I say that. I think it's unlikely they disallow it because the expenses meet their criteria.
Right.
Yeah, I think.
Chief, we did have a meeting early on in the response with our FEMA rep to talk about our intended use and what would be submitted and receive some guidance up front on what would be acceptable.
Yeah, if I may just put a little bit of context on this, because like I said, I think we've said some things, we identified some things early on that we intended to use CARES Act funding for. Now that the deadline has been extended and some additional costs are coming up, we are looking at that. But down the line, we either, depending on what the expenditure was, how timely it was, how needed it was, in the moment, we either didn't spend it until we knew that it was eligible for reimbursement, or ensured that we had an existing appropriation that could fund it if we had to purchase it right away because of timeliness. We ensured that we had, like I said, we have an existing technology appropriation from town meeting that was, available to us for technology purposes for things like Windows upgrades or phone upgrades and things like that. We obviously looked at CARES first, but we made sure we had a backstop. So we weren't kind of spending money that we just couldn't pay for one way or another. And then the other thing is, if this was a normal emergency, whatever the limited expenses FEMA would reimburse us for would be paid, but then the town would be out 25% of the cost of that emergency. In this case, we've really had very little budget impact in terms of COVID expenses because of the combination of FEMA and CARES. And I do think that since we're still not out of this yet, I do think the new administration will probably look at additional ways to help local communities, especially since the vaccination program is devolved to local boards of health across the country with thus far very little support. So I do expect we'll see some more action on that, which will help.
Okay, so the tail end of that question then is looking at the other ineligible funding, which is obviously a small piece when you think about the whole pie of money that we did get. Is the 40K that you mentioned in your memo, has that been, is that the sum total? I mean, is there more outstanding that we don't know about? And where does that get, if we know that that's not going to be allowed, have we identified budgets that they're going to come from? And if any of these are ongoing expenses, have we curtailed, how are we handling that?
I mean, I think, Carrie, you can build on this, but I think a department, but I mean, there are expenditures that I think for regular department expenditures that aren't materializing because of the like I said, the extension of time of the pandemic. And so I think that the departmental budgets will be able to find offsets for those, but I don't care if you want to talk in more detail on that.
Yeah, so the 40,000 is the sum total of what we believe to be ineligible expenditures, pandemic response to date. So from March forward through the end of through the end of September. That's what we have audited, and we are in the process of assigning those costs to existing budget appropriations and don't expect to have any issue in doing so. We haven't done it yet because with the holidays, people have taken some time off, but we're back at that this week.
So, Carrie, is it fair to, and Stephen, this is, or all of you actually, is it fair to assume that now, as we're have months of experience behind us and regulations, as Tom pointed out, we're evolving in terms of how they came down to us. Is it fair to assume now that by and large, we're trying to be confident that we have either pre-approval on some of these expenses, or just from experience, we now know that they will or will not meet the regulations as defined?
I guess from an overall standpoint, and I think Tom can talk in more detail from an operational standpoint, but I want to try to touch on this a little bit, but I think I want to be clear that if there's something that is a need for pandemic response and it's needed now, and we're not sure, we may move ahead. We may try and define it. We will obviously identify an offset for a department budget, or maybe if there's an appropriation or something, an existing encumbrance or something like that we would look forward to fund it. But there hasn't really been that much, but I just want to convey that if there's a need and we need to take action quickly for something, waiting for a bureaucratic review may not be in the town's best interests. But I think for the vast majority of everything else, we will be looking to see what is eligible and what's not. The other thing is a lot of those expenditures that we talked about, the kind of non-eligible, I mean, a lot of that stuff was early on when we weren't getting a lot of great guidance. I think we all have learned a lot. So I don't foresee unanticipated, not unanticipated. I don't see a lot of ineligible spending, but the number one priority remains protecting the safety of the public and our employees and ending the pandemic. So I just don't want to say out loud, yes, we are going to make sure every dollar is approved before it gets spent, in case something comes up that we need to take action on.
No, I think generally the dynamics are understood when you're in a situation like this, and so that's why I was referencing, the evolving regulations and your own accrued experience at this point. And then I assume you have an opportunity to collaborate on this and weigh these options. When something is needed that needs to be implemented in a timely fashion. Terry.
Just a quick follow-up on one of your questions, Linda, about the school unassigned amount. It looks like it's 273,000. And what I'm trying to understand is whether that's the Concord Public School, the high school, or both. I'm kind of assuming it's both. I don't know if that's right, but if you have talked to Carlisle about how this would all be allocated, or is there some mechanism for figuring that out later? It's a high school expense.
Well, the expenses would be based on the assessment, the existing formula assessment for the school, for the district. But most of that, I think the vast majority of that is Concord Public Schools.
Okay. Any other questions why we have this talent before us to answer these questions?
Linda, I appreciate you saying that, because I think I'm giving you the answer to that question about expenditures, but it really is a team-based approach. And I appreciate Tom and Carrie being here, kind of doing a lot of detailed work. But every department head and many division managers are really heavily involved in identifying the needs. So it really has been a team-based approach to making a lot of these decisions. There hasn't been really unilateral decision-making at any level. It's been, let's talk it out and make sure that we all, that all of our needs are being addressed and met, and we're sharing resources as best we can. So I do appreciate you making a comment about the talent, because it's not just the two of them. It's really many parts of the organization that have helped get through this.
Understood. We have these two individuals before us, and we keep asking them to come back and answer our questions. So I wanted to give them their due. So thank you for also pointing that out. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Right. The next item is, and this just came up recently today, the state legislative session, I guess technically closes tomorrow, I understand. We got a request from Senator Barrett asking for support for S29995, an act creating the next generation roadmap to mass climate policy. And I at least wanted to bring this before the board in terms of their willingness to send a letter of support, particularly given that climate change is one of our, and energy resilience and sustainability is an important item in our board goals. So it's here just before us for your reaction. Matt, I happen to see your hand go up first.
I assume Jane has the same comment, that the legislature passed this and Governor Baker signed it on December 30th. So I don't know. I mean, I guess we fully support the goals, but it's signed legislation at this point.
So, yes, it is signed legislation. It has gone up to the governor. And I think there is some concern that it may be vetoed. And so
He signed it December 30th.
So the information I got today, I'm not sure where it came from then. That's interesting.
At least that's what I'm reading.
Okay, good.
Do you have any other info?
Matt, it was circulated by our sustainability officer and somebody who's been following it. So I'm not sure that that's entirely the time frame. Let me just. I think
Kate is here.
Kate, can you perhaps speak to that?
Yeah, so just late last night, the conference committee that is run by Senator Barrett released the report, which is this new language that they've been working on reconciling the House and the Senate version of this climate bill. And so just this afternoon, the Senate voted 38-2, or very overwhelmingly, for this climate bill. And so it will go to the governor, I believe, tomorrow. So there's been an upswell of climate activists and advocates and Senator Barrett and many of the other legislators asking for support of this bill to the governor for him to sign.
What did the governor sign last week?
I'm not sure. They released the governor's executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs released a climate roadmap, which has a very similar name. So that may be what you're thinking of, Matt. It's a little.
No, but I'm seeing the S2995 signed.
I'm not sure. All I know is that just late last night, the conference committee came out with this version that was voted on today.
Yeah, the information I received was earlier today. So
there's been, this is under heavy discussion, so I would tend to, I don't think we have time right now in the select board meeting. I would offer that I would trust Kate's research and understanding, and it certainly was mine, that there is a there's a, let's just call it, maybe it's a second draft, or it's new language added to, but it's what's on the governor's table for signature is new today.
Okay. All right.
Susan.
Yeah, I have a comment and a question. There's a typo. This is on the third paragraph down, next to the last line. It says work to develop the next gen roadmap bill. It says to how. It should be on how to move the Commonwealth forward starting now. And my question is the bullet points that, this is, I guess, is to Kate. The bullet points listed under additionally Concord Select Board supports, I'm assuming those are from the sustainability plan that we approved. Is that correct?
It's a good question, Susan. Yeah, I pulled those from a letter that the select board discussed a little while back. That was a letter to this conference committee that was working on this version of the bill. So those bullet points were from that letter. So something that you all had already discussed support for. And I pulled in a couple other bullets from pieces that are in the bill that are aligned with our climate action plan, but very much what you've already discussed and supported in the past. Thank you.
Jane.
Well, I just want to come clean and say I'm the point person of encouragement on this, and I would encourage us all to give Linda our authorization to sign the letter. And I just want to thank Kate, because I think you did a masterful job at taking what was a fairly hamstringed process and developing a letter that is very unique to Concord, as was just discussed. And it was funny because some of the individuals who contacted me were surprised when I suggested that I thought that the select board would take this up today, because they couldn't imagine that a select board had the time to turn something around in time to meet the legislative session's end. So I just want to, this is a great example of the kind of staff and kind of abilities that, perhaps it's because we're meeting every Monday, but nevertheless, the ability to be timely is a mark for Concord. So thank you.
Jane, thank you for saying that. And I'll just add that, I shot that request to her at the end of the morning, and she turned it around immediately, and that is terrific. All right. So do I hear a motion to authorize the chair to send a letter of support for S2995 to the governor?
Move to authorize the chair to submit a letter to Governor Baker in support of S2995, an act creating a next generation roadmap for Massachusetts climate policy.
Second.
Okay. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Escobedo?
Aye.
Ms. Hotchkiss?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Ms. Ackerman?
Aye.
And myself, Ms. Bates, aye.
That's unanimous, and the chair so declares. So, Kate, thank you very much. Stephen, would you like to make a comment?
Well, not about this, about another legislative matter, since we're on legislative topics.
So before you move on to that, Kate, do you mind expediting this for us?
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you all for your support and quick turnaround. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. If you need a signature, I'll look for your letter and we'll get that out. Thank you very much. Okay, Stephen, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, so just briefly, I did get a note while we were sitting here that the town caucus bill did get reported favorably on a committee, and the expectation from Barrett staff is that it'll be enacted tomorrow. So
say that again, Stephen. I'm sorry.
So I just received a note a few minutes ago from Barrett staff that the town caucus bill has been reported favorably from committee, and she expects it to be enacted tomorrow. And I only mention it because that's another example of the board and our legislative delegation and town staff being nimble and getting it together pretty quickly. So because that came up, I wanted to pile on and say that that is another example of us being able to do that.
Well, that's good news, and hopefully we'll have the I's dotted and that signed and sealed and delivered tomorrow. So thank you very much for that news. Good. All right. I'm going to move on now next to the town manager's FY20 evaluation. And let me say, I want to say a few words about the process, and also mention that just this afternoon, a draft was sent just before the meeting. A draft was sent to each of the select board members for the purpose of this discussion. You know, as the town recognizes, it's the select board responsibility to evaluate the town manager. Per his contractual arrangement, the select board did give the town manager a 6-month review, which was previously discussed. And he received that evaluation report mid-May of 2020. From there, we then just prior, because the town meeting was delayed this year till September 13th, just prior to that timeframe, I asked each of the then seated select board members to respond to the standard form that is used for, and we've used in town previously, to evaluate the town manager. The reason I asked for that at that time was that the chair, then Michael Lawson, had been the key staff select board member who had worked most closely with the town manager for the entire year. It had been an exceptional year in terms of a number of events, not least of which was the COVID pandemic. And so I thought it was important that the then seated board members, including himself, respond to that. Simultaneously, and so the select board members did in fact complete the evaluation process, sent all their responses to Jeremy Romano, and who was the person who collected those, including myself, sent my response independently to Jeremy. Simultaneously, I asked the town manager to complete a self-assessment of his first year in his new role as town manager. And also, he also completed that assignment. At some point, those collective documents were all sent to me. And what I have done now is compiled all of those responses as a select board evaluation response and presenting to you for the first time in draft form. Let me just highlight that, as you can see, I included sections on sort of setting the background and at the time of entry for the new town manager for the full year, and the existing infrastructure and what were some of the conditions that were present when he first assumed his role as town manager. Clearly that included following the tenure of our former town manager, who had been here for a long time. That included in place a longstanding and very competent and highly regarded senior management team. And included on that senior management team was an established deputy town manager who also essentially was managing somewhat of a department format at that point, beyond the town manager, beyond her role as deputy town manager. Also at the point of when Stephen assumed his new responsibilities. He had just been through a couple months earlier the application and interview process, and what had been provided at that time was some extensive information about highlighting the characteristics of the town itself in terms of what they valued, as well as some job expectations for the new town manager. And I think, so at the 6-month standpoint, the select board did in fact provide some very specific reactions and suggestions and some comments to the town manager. There had been some early missteps during the early transition phase for the town manager as he got to know the town staff and reached out to the town staff and internally as well as reached out externally. The concerns we had at that time regarding missteps were brought to the attention of the town manager directly by the select board. They were acknowledged by the town manager, and we then felt that we could move on. Within days after yes, about 60 days or so, the town manager, assuming his responsibilities, was the unfortunate IT security breach, which resulted in the departure of some key staff, and including a department head. And also because of related investigations, public information and disclosure about what was going on at that time was limited, which no doubt was difficult for the public, was difficult for employees, and I'm sure added to the normal transition butterflies that everybody has as you're trying to get to know everybody. And all of a sudden something major like this happens, and it really unnerves, I think, people, and did cause some morale issues, and also probably concern about job security for some of our employees at the time who were remaining. And then within months after that, clearly COVID hit, and all operations were upended, and adding to the stress that was on everybody for what otherwise would have been the expected from a normal transition period. And I think because of the ever-evolving changes that were happening with COVID, we heard some more examples of that today from some of our senior staff. Regulations kept evolving. There were immediate adaptations that were required by everybody. Extremely stressful for our staff. They responded incredibly well. And I think, as did the manager, town manager, in terms of decisively handling much of this. Was it all smooth? Absolutely not. Were there things you wish you could change now that you have the hindsight, how long this was going to last and what we were going to be going through? Yes. But in the main, I think there has been positive recognition for what the town manager and the senior staff, how they have responded and how they acted decisively, and are still looking to planning for the future in terms of what we need to cope with next, just to manage the pandemic. So the only reason I'm going into some of the detail on reminding all of us about some of the conditions that existed for the first year of a new town manager and all of us as we went through this transition, is that there have been some extraordinary circumstances, some of which have been handled very well, some of which provided some rocky times and some stressful times, and we continue to have to navigate all of that together. In this context, I think that the normal opportunity for a new town manager to acquire in-depth knowledge of all things Concord, as someone has used that phrase, and I like it, has both been accelerated, I would say, but in other ways shortchanged. And that applies not only to gaining knowledge about the municipal functions, but also in terms of working with our community at large. So I think there's a lot more work that will need to be done through the rest of the time we're under the pandemic umbrella, as well as hopefully some month down the road here soon as we come out of it. There will be a lot of work still that I would label personally transition related, still transition related in terms of learning more in depth about the town and all the resources that are available to us internally and externally. So let me just go on and say that in this draft, as you can see, I took the sections and categories from the town manager's evaluation form and separated them out and tried to capture and synthesize the majority of the I'll use the word majority, the majority of the comments and suggestions, sometimes pointing out strengths, sometimes pointing out weaknesses, and sometimes pointing out suggestions for how to proceed. I tried to capture all of that and synthesize that under each of the categories. Those categories are relationship to the select board, overall leadership, general management, budget management, personnel management, communications and public relations, personal qualities and characteristics, and then I provided a summary. And I guess at this point, I'd like to stop there and ask specifically for some discussion in the section related to relationship with the select board. And if you have other additional comments, having read now this draft, I certainly would entertain them. And I do intend to sort of summarize the summary this as well after I have some additional comments here. Susan.
Yeah, thank you, Linda, for all the work that was involved in putting this together, but I don't seem to have the email. So I'm not going to be commenting, but if whoever sent it out, Jeremy or whoever, could forward it to me, that'd be great. Thank you.
All right. Sorry, Susan. That's interesting in and of itself. Okay, Jane.
Thank you for circulating this and moving the process forward. And this is not going to come as a surprise because I've mentioned it a number of times. One of my concerns with the evaluation right now, and it's not a directional, it's just it's coming out of time. In other words, this evaluation represents thoughts and comments and knowledge based on something 6 months ago. And I'm concerned about the kind of advice, there's a lot of value to an evaluation process, in my opinion, because it gives everybody a chance to give feedback and to take feedback and to have a give and take process. So I just want to thank you for doing this in a public setting such as this. But I'm concerned that, for instance, I think Matt probably would have input now, which he didn't have at the time of the evaluation.
Jane, may I just, I appreciate your comments and thank you for raising them, because I failed to mention that I did reference the point of just before the town meeting, September 13th, right? And so you're right, we're missing valuable, we were already into the FY21 year, and I want to be clear about that. And I forgot to mention that. And so we have missed already 3 months, not missed, but this particular evaluation, summary evaluation, does not reflect the last 3 months. And items that we had already built into our FY21 goals, given the comments that we had already submitted for the FY20 evaluation. So I'm sorry for interrupting you, Jane, but you're reminding me I did leave out that important information, so thank you. Yeah.
Good. So I just think it would be helpful to think about how we want to put this in the process of, how, so that we're not always 6 months, or 3 months off. I don't think that's in the select board's best interest. I don't think it's in Stephen's best interest. I wouldn't want that as if somebody were doing my evaluation process. So how do we how do we get into the catch up? This may or may not have any effect on my input, depending on our time frame. But I think
so we know we have a June. So we know we have a June annual town meeting date at this point, and all of us will be seated, I assume, right through town meeting, and so there will be an opportunity, as we'll be looking at an additional town manager full evaluation at that time. That's not to say that ongoing feedback isn't being given to the town manager constantly, I assume, by each of us. Terry?
Yeah, thank you, Linda, for putting this on the agenda. I think this is one of the most important things that the select board can do during the year. The town manager runs the town, and we are the supervisors of the town manager. So this is a very important function for us. And thank you, Jane. I do totally agree with your comments. I think we should try to figure out how we can incorporate the last several months. Particularly, I would love to incorporate Matt's goals. I think that Matt was not here a year ago, but I think that going forward, he should be involved in setting the goals for the upcoming year for the town manager. And another thing that I think we should incorporate is citizen input. I've received several requests recently from citizens asking how can they give input? And I've had to say, well, I wrote my evaluation in August. So the thing is, now there are new comments. We need to find a way then to incorporate the board's last several months, Matt's goals, and citizen input.
So there are certainly, after the select board has had their discussion, finish their discussion here, there certainly will be an opportunity to listen to the public. Okay. But I think we are looking at, the first year evaluation. Jane, go ahead.
I had one other question. It just came up. And I think you covered the process that existed with the 6-month review. And this process is somewhat similar, but I wasn't sure. Was there a senior management team piece to this one as well? Because there was in the first piece.
There was not in this piece. Okay. Yep. And the process I was talking about was really for the entire year, for the entire year evaluation. And its component parts. So have I left you confused there, Jane?
No, I thought that was a beneficial component of an evaluation process. So, and given the amount of close, well, not close, I understand the social distancing, but the greater, the amount of time people have spent together, it was an opportunity for that to have potentially been included.
Yeah. Yes. So one of the recommendations in the draft is clearly for the town manager to work with the human resource director to again solicit that kind of input, both for the benefit of the town manager and for the senior management team in terms of their working relationship and effectiveness going forward. Terry, yes.
It seems that it would probably be productive for us to continue this discussion next week, since one of the members didn't receive it at all, and the rest of us received it a few hours before the meeting. And clearly, Linda, you've put a lot of thought into it and outlined a lot of the background really well and put it in categories. But I don't feel that I've had enough chance to think through what you've written and be able to intelligently comment yet. That I would just need a little more time, I think. And that way, I think we could incorporate some of the input also hopefully from Matt and from citizens.
Can I ask a question? What was the process for evaluating Chris Whalen? Because I think that there's probably an existing process, and I think in fairness to me that we should try and mirror that.
Well, I will just offer as the only select board member, well, that's not true. Linda had and Linda, feel free if you would rather describe this.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jane. I mean, you're the senior person here, and I'll add to it.
I would just say that I think that, and I say this as someone who, as chair, oversaw that process. I will say of my tenure, I thought it was poorly run. I think it had become somewhat perfunctory. And, since there was already a retirement in the offing, it was less about an evaluation and more about a commentary. I would just say I would not wish that process on someone new to a town or new to a position, because I don't think there was a lot of there wasn't an expectation of growth. There wasn't an expectation of a lot there. Not that we didn't hold him in high esteem. I'm just saying at that point it was somewhat, as I said, perfunctory. And I know I could have, as a chair, done a much better job. And there just wasn't, well, I'll just leave it at that.
So I certainly am happy to continue. I am going to ask for public comment today if there on this topic. I definitely concur that we need to continue to next week, given particularly given that Susan apparently did not receive that, which is very disturbing. And as Terry points out, people need more time to digest what was presented to them. I do think, however, I hear the board's concern about trying to incorporate recent feedback in for the last 3 months into this particular evaluation. But the feedback, the process that was outlined initially, and that the evaluation responses that you were asked to provide were for the first year in office. So I want to give some more thought to that, but I just want to set the parameters there in terms of what you were asked to respond to. I will point out that and well, let me leave it there at this point. Are there any other comments from the select board right now? Yes, Matt.
Yeah, so I guess I would like to get clarity a little bit about what is expected of me, because, up until now, of course, I haven't participated because it's, at least as advertised, this was an evaluation for a period prior to when I was on the board. So as a new member,
Right.
I wouldn't have had anything to say. On the other hand, I do appreciate, and I think that it would be a service to Stephen as well if, we had more sort of a forward-looking recommendations. And of course, I've started to form those opinions. It may be that formally it still doesn't make sense because this was an FY20 evaluation. And we are in an awkward position where we're looking at it months later. But I did want to say I'm happy to participate in however it makes sense, but I also would defer to the board members of FY20 as to how this process should proceed.
Thank you, Matt. And I think there is a way. My initial response, and I'll think about this some more as well. I think there is a way to look forward with some of the specific recommendations that are built into the draft that we could come back to separately as a select board and discuss or capture in an additional way. Terry?
I agree with that. I think that we could do it in 2 steps. One would be the eval, and the second step would be the forward-looking goal setting. But I would ask that we not delay, since we're already behind schedule due to COVID and everything else, that we do the goal setting right away as soon as we finish the eval.
Yeah.
I'll give something like that.
Okay, thank you. Susan?
Yeah, I just had a question about the goal setting, because I think a couple of meetings ago, Stephen talked about 3 goals. Inclusivity was the first one.
There were 2, I think. Yeah.
Okay, and then right, there were 2, and then there were others. He said it really was a sum of a lot of different parts, but related to workplace satisfaction and the health of the town staff. And then he added that if he were to do it today, vaccination would be on the top of the list. So I'm not sure. Those have been stated. So, but there are additional ones, is what Terry's referring to. Is that right, Terry?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, I'm referring to, well, you haven't seen Linda's narrative, but embedded in there are things like suggestions for growth and improvement in the future.
Yeah, so I think that's what I was referring to earlier, that maybe we can pull those out as part of the forward-looking as part 2, because that would be a natural outgrowth from that. All right. Stephen, yes.
I just, and I don't want this to come across the wrong way, because I hopefully, even after the 6-month evaluation, I hope we demonstrated or on regular occasions that I welcome and am open to feedback even when it isn't positive. I agree with Jane's statement that the opportunities for growth and development and for building a relationship with the board depends on regular feedback and regular communication. But the evaluation is a formal process that is, I think, referenced both in my agreement and in the charter. And my only concern is, coming up with a process that doesn't conform to those things in the name of it as kind of a substitute for just an ongoing dialogue about feedback. And so I do want regular feedback, but the evaluation is a formalized process. And and like I said, I want to be clear on what the structures of those things are, because they're structured for a reason. And so I just want to make sure, and I do appreciate citizen feedback, but it's as a part of a formal evaluation. I'm not sure that that's, a part of that structure, so to speak. And I welcome feedback from the community as well. But like I said, an evaluation is a formalized document that has, some legal ramifications to it. And I just want to make sure that, this is my job. I don't, this is my career. And so I want to make sure that as the formal document of my evaluation gets constructed, it's done so, in the manner that that the structures provide for.
All right, thank you for that comment. Okay. Are there any other comments from the select board at this time? Matt?
Yeah, I guess I would just follow on and say that one thing I would like us to do is to take a second look for next time about the evaluation methodology, because I think that an evaluation process that includes multiple stakeholders is actually a best practice. And that, certainly the select board is the ultimate arbiter of the evaluation, but to get input from, each dimension effectively of the town manager's work, I think would be very helpful in conducting future evaluations. I don't think that it makes sense to change the rules on a retrospective evaluation, but I do think that, we should establish a methodology that we can all believe in going forward.
Thank you, Matt. All right. I think I will now move on to if there are any members of the public who would like to comment.
Yes, I'd like to comment.
Okay, Mr. Reed?
Yes, I appreciate Brooks Reed, Estabrook Road. I appreciate the chair's offer to allow public comments, but the fact that Mr. Crane's review would be on the agenda was not added until afternoon today. So I'm concerned that the interest in public comments may actually be disingenuous. It would be good to have this information posted with due notice so the public will actually know what's going to happen in the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Galis?
Yes, I simply.
I'm sorry, will you please state your address?
Mark Galis, 62 Prescott Road. Thank you very much. I simply also wanted to just say that if a document's being discussed at the meeting, the public would really benefit from having access to that document in real time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments from the public? Diane?
Diane Proctor, 57 Sudbury Road. I want to concur that when you ask Linda so thoughtfully for public comment, we haven't even seen the document, nor can we react, nor do we even know the categories necessarily, except remembering those that were used to evaluate Chris. And so to be fair to Stephen and to be able to be thoughtful, it would be helpful if we had been able to see the document in advance. Thank you very much. I know you all are working very hard, but it would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Any other comments? Yes, Pamela?
Is it possible to get a copy?
Sorry, would you just state your name and your address?
Sorry, Pamela Dritt, 13 Concord Green, Unit 4.
Okay.
Thank you all for your hard work. Is it possible to get a copy of the manager's report and the other reports that you discuss? Is that available to us as a public? I don't know.
It isn't right now. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Tanya.
Hi, Tanya Galis, 62 Prescott Road. Just in addition to everyone else's comments about seeing document, Linda, I'm not 100% sure that it is not against the open meeting law for you to be compiling the comments as opposed to a third party compiling them. If that is what's desired, that may need to be looked into. I was just thinking, because if you compile it, it does reflect your take on whatever you think should be shared or how it should be summarized. By the way, I just want to bring that up. In addition, I appreciate very much your compassionate approach to the whole process and the understanding and the sympathetic approach. And so we look forward to seeing some of the comments that were made so we are better informed. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Any other comments? I've got two screens here to catch up with, so let me just check. All right, I don't see any other comments at this time. So I'm going to move on to miscellaneous correspondence. I'll comment that we received a couple of pieces of correspondence related to the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail Advisory Committee with some people from the community anticipating that the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail Advisory Committee is going to request an extension to their charge to include the reformatory trail. And there are some concerns from this correspondence expressed that this is inappropriate. And so no doubt we'll be hearing more about this. And people are also requesting that before the board would take any vote on any such matter that might come before them, that they allow for public comment. Matt, I see your hand raised, so do you?
I just wanted to note, just to recall our citizen correspondence policy that we have established, and that, I think we should, on an ongoing basis, review these letters, and if they qualify, and I believe some of them this week did, that we should publish them as opposed to, simply summarizing that we received them. I think that we were doing that, and then it seems like maybe now we've fallen off of that path.
For several months, that policy has not been fully discussed and adopted by the board. And so we are not operating under that policy at this time. And so for several months now, we have been referencing the categories of correspondence that have been coming in.
I thought we were doing it informally. We were following it informally to understand whether it was going to work or not.
I think that was an expressed concern or a suggestion, but I'm not sure that was fully adopted by the select board. So Susan, would you like to comment on the process as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I know that we discussed it, but it got tabled. But I think that process we have to figure that out before we can determine what rises to the level, what of importance over another piece or issue. So that's part of that same conversation that's incomplete, as far as I understand it.
Yeah. So in the interest of transparency in the interim, what I'm trying to do is at least capture some concerns, the correspondence that is coming in that is addressed to all of us at the select board level. Okay. I'll just finish that we also had one piece of correspondence that questioned whether or not there was other examples of litigation against citizens in town, and whether or not there was another example of unlimited spending towards any one litigation. And that captures the correspondence that was brought to my attention this last week. Okay. Are there any other general public comments at this point? Okay, Diane.
Thank you. I'm having trouble getting my screen to stay stable. Diane Proctor, 57 Sudbury Road. Thank you, Linda. I don't know if you're going to mention this, but it's the League of Women Voters. Are you going to?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, the League of Women Voters is going to hold a candidate forum or debate 3 weeks before the actual election that will be available online. It's going to be on, I believe it's March 7th, Sunday, March 7th. If you look at your calendars, I think I wasn't going to say this, but since it hasn't come up, I think that's the right date. And the timing we'll be able to present later, but it will be available for citizens to watch, even if they cannot attend that conference at the time. As we know, the League has a formal process for doing this, and I think this year it's going to be particularly valuable for the town. So I want you to know that that's going to happen, and I hope it will facilitate the whole process of the elections that go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that announcement. Okay. If there are no other comments, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. Well, Susan, you're muted.
Sorry. Move to adjourn.
Is there a second? Is there a second?
Second.
All right. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Escobedo?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Ms. Ackerman?
Aye.
Ms. Hotchkiss?
Aye.
And myself, Ms. Bates. Aye.
That's unanimous. Thank you, everyone, for your input this evening. Thank you.